A single button press, a city vanishes. Millions of lives evaporate in a single breath. In 1945, humanity witnessed this firsthand. Twice. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. A light brighter than the sun, and hell opened up in broad daylight. You think that was the final warning? No, we did the opposite. We built more, replicated them, and hid them in cold steel bunkers. Today, more than 12,500 nuclear warheads are still waiting to be unleashed. Each warhead is enough to turn a city to ash. The entire arsenal is enough to wipe out the human race, not just once, but dozens of times. We reassure ourselves that this is a balance of power, that as long as everyone is afraid, no one will dare to make a move. But the truth is, we are betting the fate of our entire civilization on the sanity of individuals who are inherently calculating, flawed, and weak. We live on the hope that no one is foolish. But what if one day, just one day, the origin of the atomic bomb. It didn't start with a bang, but with a whisper. A whisper that crossed the Atlantic in 1939, in a letter that Albert Einstein, the greatest mind of the century, sent to US President Franklin D. Roosevelt. That whisper carried a terrifying warning. Hitler's Germany might be on the path to creating a new type of weapon. A bomb of unimaginable power unleashed from the very heart of matter. The world was already engulfed in the flames of World War II. The old gods of war tanks, warships, airplanes were still roaring on the battlefronts. But in the laboratories of Berlin, London, and Chicago, a new god, a far more powerful monster, was slowly being born from equations on a blackboard. Einstein's whisper was not a hypothesis. It was a prophecy, and America listened. The fear that the enemy would possess the ultimate weapon first became an obsession. From that obsession, the most secret, most ambitious, and perhaps most dangerous project in human history was born: the Manhattan Project. This was not just a research program, it was a convocation. Thousands of the planet's most brilliant minds were secretly gathered, like ascetic monks invited to a remote monastery with a single purpose: to create a miracle or a curse for humanity. With a budget of $2 billion at the time, a colossal, some equivalent to tens of billions today, this project had no room for failure. And at the center of this storm, the high priest of this new scientific cult was a man full of contradictions. J. Robert Oppenheimer, theoretical physicist with haunting blue eyes, a lover of Sanskrit poetry and Hindu philosophy, an intellectual who could discuss Marcel Proust as passionately as he spoke of subatomic particles. It was this sensitive and profound man who was tasked with leading the creation of the most insensitive and brutal weapon. He was the embodiment of the project's entire paradox, using the pinnacle of human intellect to create a tool for the most primitive destruction. In the New Mexico desert, a ghost city rose from nothing. Los Alamos, completely isolated from the outside world, surrounded by barbed wire fences and vows of silence, it became a giant incubator for the egg of death. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of sweat, tobacco, and an almost tangible tension. The scientists worked relentlessly, racing against time, against an unseen enemy, and against their own moral limits. They were the ones trying to open Pandora's box at the subatomic level. Its principle, in theory, sounded elegant: a nuclear fission chain reaction. Take a heavy nucleus like uranium-235 and shoot a neutron into it. The nucleus splits, releasing enormous energy and more neutrons. These new neutrons then strike other nuclei, creating an exponential storm of energy, a subatomic avalanche. 1 gram of matter, if fully converted, could create an explosion equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. This was no longer a weapon. It was the wrath of the cosmos compressed into the palm of a hand. But from theory to reality was a chasm. The scientists faced 2 paths, 2 different demons. One was a little boy, the bomb using uranium-235, which operated on a gun mechanism. firing one mass of uranium into another to achieve critical mass. The other path was more complex. Fat Man, using plutonium-239, an artificial element. Due to its instability, they had to design an implosion mechanism, using conventional explosives to crush a hollow sphere of plutonium into itself, creating an immense density to trigger the chain reaction. Every day at Los Alamos was a struggle with the unknown. They were both scientists and modern-day alchemists, trying to turn matter into pure power. Oppenheimer moved between laboratories like a ghost, pushing, inspiring, and carrying the weight of a waiting world on his shoulders. That burden was not just scientific, it was moral. Night after night, these greatest minds tossed and turned with the question, what are we creating? A tool to end the war and save millions of lives? Or a one-way ticket to humanity's apocalypse? And then the day came. July 16th, 1945, at a desert site codenamed Trinity, history itself seemed to hold its breath. The first plutonium bomb, the gadget, sat atop a 100-foot steel tower, silent as a sleeping god. Scientists watched anxiously from bunkers miles away, some betting the bomb would be a dud, while others feared a worse scenario, that the explosion could be so powerful it might ignite the Earth's atmosphere. In the final seconds before the explosion, silence enveloped the desert. It was perhaps the heaviest silence in human history. And then, at 5 hours, 29 minutes, and 45 seconds a.m., it happened. There was no sound at first, only light. False dawn, an artificial sun rising from the ground, 1,000 times brighter than the real sun. The light turned night into day, desert sand into molten glass. Seconds later, the shockwave arrived, a roar that tore the silence apart, a blast of hot wind like the breath of a dragon. From the epicenter, a colossal pillar of fire rose to the sky, swirling into the iconic mushroom cloud, a monument to the birth of a new era. In the observation bunker, the scientists' reactions were varied. Some cheered, some applauded, but many were just silent, horrified by the destructive beauty they had just created. Kenneth Bainbridge, the test director, turned to Oppenheimer and said a simple but haunting sentence. Now we are all sons of bitches. But it was Oppenheimer who understood the moment most profoundly. As he watched the mushroom cloud ascend, his mind did not turn to victory. He thought of an ancient Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, and the words of the god Vishnu came to his mind. Years later, he recalled, I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. In his moment of greatest success, Oppenheimer recognized the most terrible tragedy. They had succeeded. They had stolen the fire of the gods. The genie was out of the bottle, and nothing could ever put it back. Just 3 weeks later, the prophecy of destruction became reality. On August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay flew over the skies of Hiroshima. Below, a city was starting a new day, unaware that it was about to become the sacrifice in the first chapter of the nuclear age. The little boy bomb was dropped. 43 seconds later, it detonated. The world below vanished in the blink of an eye. A fireball engulfed the city's center, with temperatures reaching millions of degrees. Those near the epicenter were instantly vaporized, leaving only their charred shadows etched onto the remaining walls. The shockwave flattened everything for miles. Tens of thousands died instantly. 3 days later, on August 9th, Fat Man fell on Nagasaki. The scenario repeated. Japan surrendered. World War II was over. But another war, a colder war, had just begun. The consequences of the two bombs were not just the ruined cities, not just the hundreds of thousands who died from the blast. The burns and the slow poison of radiation sickness for years to come. The greatest consequence was a permanent shift in global political psychology. The atomic bomb was no longer a weapon. It had become the key to absolute power, the ultimate symbol of dominance. The world had realized that from now on, the survival of humanity would depend on the restraint of the nations that held the power of death in their hands. Oppenheimer, the father of the monster, lived the rest of his life in regret. suspected by the very government he had served. But the story of the birth of the atomic bomb is not just his story. It is the story of how man, with his extraordinary intellect, created something that could surpass his own control. But the question for you is, if you were in his position, in the shadow of a world war with the fear that the enemy might do it first, what would you have chosen? Does a moral line exist when the survival of an entire nation is at stake? Leave your thoughts below. A like shows you have walked with us through this haunting first chapter. The US and the Soviet Union, the Cold War era. In the previous chapter, we witnessed the birth of a monster, god of death, born from the New Mexico desert, named the atomic bomb. When the radioactive dust settled on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world had changed. The United States was not just a victor in World War II, they had become a new god, the only nation holding Zeus's thunderbolt, possessing a monopoly on the power that could decide the fate of the entire planet. A brief moment, the world order seemed to be set. America stood at the pinnacle, and the rest of the world could only look up in awe and fear. But in human history, no god reigns forever. On August 29, 1949, on a remote steppe in Kazakhstan, an artificial flash tore through the sky. The Soviet Union had successfully detonated its first atomic bomb, codenamed First Lightning. It was not just a weapons test, it was a seismic echo, shaking the foundations of the nascent world order. America's crown of monopoly was shattered. The atomic god now had a rival. The world held its breath. The era of unipolar dominance had ended after just 4 years. A new era, far darker and more tense, had begun. The Cold War. How did the Soviet Union catch up so quickly? The answer lay not only in the talent of their scientists, but also in the shadows that moved within the very heart of the Manhattan Project. One of those shadows was Klaus Fuchs, a brilliant German physicist working at Los Alamos. Driven by the ideological belief that a unipolar world with nuclear weapons would be unstable, Fuchs secretly passed the most critical designs of the plutonium bomb to the Soviet Union. He didn't do it for money, he did it for a twisted notion of balance. He became a reverse Prometheus. Instead of stealing fire from the gods for man, he gave fire to another god, hoping the two fires would consume each other before they consumed the world. Fuchs's actions threw the United States into a panic. The fear of communist infiltration spread across the country, fueling the dark era of McCarthyism. But above all, it ignited a race with no finish line. The nuclear arms race. If the atomic bomb was a monster, the scientists decided the only way to tame it was to create an even bigger monster. In 1952, the US detonated the first hydrogen bomb, a thermonuclear weapon with a destructive power hundreds, even thousands of times greater than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. It no longer used fission, but nuclear fusion, the same process that powers the sun. The US had once again created a sun of its own, but it was a sun from hell. Just 9 months later, in 1953, the Soviet Union also had the H-bomb. The chase continued. The arsenals of both sides skyrocketed from a few hundred to thousands, then tens of thousands of warheads. Every major city in both nations was in the crosshairs of the other. Humanity was living under a constant shadow, a sword of Damocles hanging by a single thread. And it was from this extreme fear that a strange, insane, yet ironclad doctrine was born to dominate the world for the next half-century. It had an ironic acronym, MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction. The MAD doctrine can be summarized as follows. If you attack me with nuclear weapons, I'll have enough surviving weapons to strike you back, and both of us will be wiped off the map. Therefore, the only way to win is to never start the war. Imagine two men standing in a room full of gasoline. Holds a lit match. Both have the ability to incinerate the other, but they know that the moment the fire starts, they too will be burned to ash. The tense silence in that room, the fear of a single wrong move, was the essence of peace during the Cold War. This was the logic of madness. To maintain peace, Both superpowers spent trillions of dollars building weapons they prayed they would never have to use. They developed the nuclear triad bombers that could take off at any moment. Intercontinental ballistic missiles hidden in underground silos, and nuclear submarines lurking deep beneath the oceans. The purpose of this triad was to ensure a second strike capability. Even if a surprise attack destroyed the entire country, those submarines would still rise from the depths to deliver a retaliatory blow, ensuring the victor would not survive to celebrate. MAD became a new god, a mad and emotionless deity who ruled the world through terror. It was the reason why, despite countless proxy wars in Vietnam, Korea, and Afghanistan, the two superpowers never directly confronted each other on the battlefield. The price was too high. But this doctrine only worked as long as those holding the matches were rational. What would happen if one of them slipped? What would happen if a miscalculation, a false alarm, or an impulsive decision pushed the world to the brink? In October 1962, humanity got its answer. The world seemed normal, but in the skies over Cuba, American U-2 spy planes captured black and white photos that left the Pentagon stunned. The images showed the Soviet Union was secretly building nuclear missile launch sites on the island, just 90 miles from the Florida coast. For the first time, major American cities like Washington, D.C. and New York were within direct range, with only a few minutes of warning time. President John F. Kennedy, a young leader, faced an unimaginable choice. His military generals urged him to order immediate airstrikes and an invasion of Cuba to eliminate the threat. But Kennedy knew such an action would almost certainly trigger an all-out nuclear war. The match in the hand of the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, was also trembling. For 13 days, the world held its breath. Kennedy and his closest advisors met secretly in the White House. Instead of attacking, he decided to implement a naval quarantine around Cuba, preventing Soviet ships from delivering more weapons. It was a high-stakes game of poker. American warships deployed at sea, while Soviet cargo ships escorted by submarines headed straight for the quarantine line. One wrong shot, one misinterpreted order, could have been the final spark. Around the world, people rushed to stockpile food. Nuclear shelter drills were held in schools. Fear was no longer an abstract concept. It was present in every breath, in every radio broadcast. Behind the scenes, top-secret negotiations took place. Kennedy and Khrushchev exchanged tense letters. The president's brother, Robert Kennedy, secretly met with the Soviet ambassador. Finally, a compromise was reached in the dark. The Soviet Union would withdraw the missiles from Cuba. In return, the U.S. publicly promised not to invade Cuba and secretly agreed to withdraw its own missiles from Turkey, a move the public was unaware of at the time. The world breathed a collective sigh of relief. The two men in the room of gasoline had taken a step back from the brink together. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the moment humanity looked directly into the face of annihilation, and in a rare moment of sanity, chose life. The crisis changed everything. The fear didn't disappear, but it became more real. The Moscow-Washington hotline was established, so leaders could communicate directly in future crises. The first arms control treaties began to be negotiated. The atomic bomb, once a weapon of war, had officially become a diplomatic tool, a giant gun, always on the negotiating table, silent but powerful. The Cold War era continued for decades, but it was a struggle fought in the shadows. It's governed by the insane logic of MAD, with the memory of those 13 days in October 1962 as a constant reminder of the price of a mistake. That crisis was like a horror movie where the entire world was the audience. But for the two men at the center of the storm, it was an unimaginable weight. The question for you: when faced with global annihilation, is courage to strike first, to show strength, or to find a way out in the dark, even at the cost of honor? Between survival and the pride of a superpower, what would you choose? Leave your ideas below. A like and share show you have journeyed with us through history's most breathtaking moments. Britain, France, China, ambition to become a great power. In the previous chapter, we stood on the brink of destruction, watching two giants, the US and the Soviet Union, play a mad game of poker with the fate of all humanity. The world seemed to be split in two, ruled by the cruel logic of mutually assured destruction. Any other nation appeared to be just a pawn on their chessboard, living and dying at the will of these two new gods. Tense confrontations, from the Berlin Crisis to the Korean War, made the entire globe tremble at the prospect of an all-out nuclear war. But history is never a play with only two main characters, the shadow of the two giants. Other powers, old kings and rising dragons, also yearned for a place in the spotlight. They did not want to be spectators in someone else's drama. They wanted to write their own scripts, and they knew that, in this new era, the most powerful pen was the nuclear flame, a weapon that not only changed the military balance, but also reshaped the global geopolitical map. This is the story of three nations, three ambitions, three different obsessions, as they resolved to join the most exclusive and dangerous club on the planet, the Nuclear Club. These stories are not just about technology or military might, but also about national identity, historical fears, and the desire to assert their status in a chaotic post-World War II world. We will explore how Britain, France, and China, each with its own unique context, overcame countless challenges to possess this ultimate weapon, thereby forever changing the landscape of the Cold War. The United Kingdom, the last roar of an old lion. At the end of World War II, the United Kingdom emerged as one of the victorious nations, but it was a victory filled with bitterness and loss. The British Empire, once proudly called the place where the sun never sets, now faced an inevitable decline. Vast colonies stretching from India and Pakistan to African nations demanded and won their independence, marking the rapid disintegration of the empire that once ruled the world. India, the jewel in the British crown, declared independence in 1947, leading to the birth of Pakistan and initiating a wave of colonial liberation across Africa and Asia. What remained of the mighty empire were now just fragments of the past, with London witnessing its global influence gradually fade. The British economy also suffered heavy losses. The enormous cost of the war had depleted the national treasury, plunging Britain into heavy debt. Major cities like London and Coventry were devastated by German air raids, requiring massive resources for reconstruction. Meanwhile, newly emerging powers like the United States and the Soviet Union began to surpass Britain in economic and military strength. Competition from these economies, coupled with internal weaknesses, led to Britain's world leadership position being unofficially transferred to the United States, the young, wealthy, and energetic ally across the Atlantic. For London, this was not just an economic or military loss, but also a severe blow to national pride. The United Kingdom, once the center of the world, now felt pushed to the periphery of the new global order. In this context, the Manhattan Project, the Allied program to develop the atomic bomb, was a prime example of the close yet unequal collaboration between Britain and the US. British scientists, including names like James Chadwick and Klaus Fuchs, made significant contributions to this project. They brought in-depth knowledge of nuclear reactions, early research on uranium, and the determination to create a weapon that could change the course of the war. The Quebec Agreement of 1943 between Britain, the US, and Canada was a testament to the commitment to long-term cooperation, with promises of sharing technology and information related to nuclear weapons. However, this trust was quickly broken after the war. In 1946, the US Congress passed the Atomic Energy Act, completely prohibiting the sharing of nuclear secrets with any nation, including close allies like Britain. For London, this was not just a political decision, but a profound humiliation. British scientists and leaders felt betrayed by the very ally they had stood shoulder to shoulder with during the toughest years. They had helped the US discover the secret of the atom, helped set the table for the Allied victory, but were now excluded from the room where important decisions were made. Prime Minister Clement Attlee, who led Britain in the post-war period, felt particularly hurt by this change in attitude from Washington. For him and other British leaders, it was a painful reminder that their era was passing. Britain's ambition to develop nuclear weapons stemmed not only from the threat of the Soviet Union, but primarily from the fear of being forgotten on the international stage. In the post-war world, where the US and the Soviet Union were competing to become superpowers, Britain realized that nuclear power was not just a military tool, but also a symbol of power and influence. Possessing the atomic bomb meant having a seat at the top table, where global decisions were made, from the UN Security Council to NATO conferences. For a declining empire, this was the only way for the old lion to prove it still had sharp claws. In 1947, Britain secretly launched its own nuclear program under the code name High Explosive Research. However, the path to the atomic bomb was not easy. Britain lacked uranium resources, had a limited budget due to the economic crisis, and faced great pressure from the US, which did not want its ally to pursue an independent nuclear program. Nevertheless, the perseverance of British scientists and leaders, along with national pride, helped them overcome these difficulties. Research centers like Aldermaston and Harwell became secret forges, where scientists worked tirelessly to turn nuclear ambition into reality. After years of effort, on October 3, 1952, the United Kingdom reached a historic milestone by detonating its first atomic bomb at the Montebello Islands, off the northwest coast of Australia. This test, codenamed Hurricane, was unlike the American tests. There was no tower or bomber. Instead, the bomb was placed inside an old warship, HMS Plym, a symbol of Britain's past naval power. When the explosion occurred with a yield of about 25 kilotons, it was not just a scientific achievement, but a symbolic declaration. The United Kingdom was still a force to be reckoned with. However, the explosion at Montebello also carried a sense of tragedy. It was like the last roar of an old lion, full of pride but also steeped in the sadness of a bygone era. This test marked Britain's entry as the third nuclear power in the world. After the US and the Soviet Union, it paved the way for more advanced weapons development programs, including the hydrogen bomb, first tested in 1957 at Christmas Island. But at the same time, it also highlighted Britain's dependence on the US. The 1958 Mutual Defense Agreement, while partially restoring cooperation between the two countries, also required Britain to trade for technology from the US to maintain its nuclear program. The atomic bomb test at Montebello was not just a technical success, but also an effort to reshape Britain's position in a rapidly changing world. It reflected the intense aspiration of a nation that once dominated the world, now struggling to maintain its influence. However, the roar of the old lion could not hide the reality that Britain was no longer the center of global power. Dependence on the US, both in nuclear technology and strategic alliances, became an inseparable part of Britain's post-war story. Nevertheless, Britain's nuclear program achieved its key objective, ensuring its voice was still heard in international discussions. Throughout the Cold War, Britain continued to play a significant role in NATO and the UN Security Council, largely thanks to its nuclear capabilities. The explosion at Montebello was not just a historical moment, but a symbol of the resilience and determination of a nation that refused to bow to the tides of time. But behind the flash of the explosion lies the story of a fading empire, trying to hold on to the last rays of its former glory. France, the national anthem of defiance. If Britain's ambition was the sorrow of a dying empire fading under the historical sunset, and France's ambition was the brilliant pride of a nation determined never to bow to any power, be it foe or ally, France, with its illustrious cultural and military heritage from ancient Roman times to the Great Revolutions, had experienced the deepest humiliations in modern history. During World War II, Nazi Germany trampled upon this sacred land, turning Paris, the city of light, into a giant prison. The Vichy government, under the leadership of Philippe, shamefully collaborated with the invaders, betraying allies and leaving millions of French people to live in fear, hunger, and loss under foreign domination. Thousands of civilians, soldiers, and partisans sacrificed themselves in the French resistance, but the initial defeat left a wound that would not easily heal. They were liberated by the Allied forces in 1944. With fierce battles in Normandy and the advance of American, British, and Canadian divisions, but for a figure like Charles de Gaulle, the legendary general, leader of the Free French forces, this liberation was not a pure victory. It was also a bitter reminder of their dependence on the US and Britain. The powers that led the invasion and decided the fate of Europe? De Gaulle, the living embodiment of Gallic pride, the indomitable spirit of the ancient Gauls who resisted the Roman Empire, believed that a great nation could not entrust its destiny to anyone else, whether friend or foe. He once said, "France cannot be a vassal to anyone." He did not believe in the American nuclear umbrella, the commitment to protect Europe through NATO, because he deeply doubted whether Washington would be willing to sacrifice New York to protect Paris. For de Gaulle, dependence on the US was not just a military agreement, it was another form of occupation. An occupation in terms of strategy and sovereignty, where France was turned into a satellite of the superpower across the Atlantic. This stirred up an obsession from the Napoleonic era, when France was once the center of Europe, now having to beg for protection. Therefore, France chose a separate path, a lonely and incredibly expensive path that demanded great sacrifice from its recovering post-war economy. They began their own nuclear program in 1954 under the direct leadership of de Gaulle after he became prime minister and later president. This program bore a proud and provocative name, Force de Frappe, the Strike Force. This was not just a mere military plan. It was a profound philosophical statement, a core part of Gaullism that emphasized absolute national independence. It was an affirmation that France was the true master of its own destiny, not a passive member of the Western Alliance. They would have the ability to defend themselves against any enemy, be it the Soviet Union with its immense nuclear power, or any other imperial force, without needing permission or pity from Washington. The program was led by key state agencies such as the Commissariat l'Énergie Atomique, founded in 1945 by Frédéric Joliot-Curie, and later the Direction des Applications Militaires. However, this path was not easy. It faced fierce opposition from the US, including an embargo on enriched uranium and advanced nuclear technology, forcing France to research and develop from scratch. French scientists from Pierre Ballade to Raoul Daltrey worked tirelessly in secret, overcoming internal barriers from anti-nuclear political parties. On February 13, 1960, in the vast Sahara Desert in Algeria, then still a French colony and an official part of its territory, a giant mushroom cloud rose into the African sky, painting the horizon red. The first nuclear test, codenamed Gerba Blue, was a resounding success. With an estimated yield of about 70 kilotons of TNT stronger than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima and comparable to the Nagasaki bomb, the device was placed on a 100-meter tower, and the explosion created a crater tens of meters deep, with a shockwave that spread for hundreds of kilometers. It was not just a physical explosion. It was the legendary Marseillaise anthem sung with nuclear fire, an immortal symbol of national revival after years of humiliation. France announced to the world that it was back, not as a protected ally under America's shadow, but as a truly independent great power, capable of nuclear deterrence and shaping the global landscape. This event not only boosted French national morale, but also inspired other nations in Europe and the Third World, proving that independence was not a pipe dream. The Gerbois Blue event opened a new era for the French military. Just a few months later, on May 1, 1962, the second test, Gerbois Blanche, further asserted their strength. And by 1963, France had successfully tested a thermonuclear device named Canopus in Polynesia. This led to France's withdrawal from NATO's integrated military command structure on March 7, 1966, a historic decision de Gaulle made to regain full control of his armed forces. They developed strategic ballistic missile systems, like the Mirage for bomber, capable of carrying nuclear bombs. Later, the SSB's missiles, based at the Albion Plateau, and the Le Doubtable-class nuclear submarines, carrying M1, M2, and later M4, M51 missiles, forming the nuclear triad of air, land, and sea forces. These systems not only protected French territory, but also extended its influence globally. from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. However, France's nuclear path was not without controversy and severe consequences. The tests in the Sahara caused serious radioactive contamination, affecting the environment and the health of local people in Algeria, leading to tense diplomatic relations after Algeria gained independence in 1962. France was forced to move its test site to French Polynesia in the Pacific, specifically at the Mororo and Fangatofa atolls, where they conducted 193 tests from 1966 to 1996, including underground tests that caused seismic shocks and ocean pollution. These tests sparked international protests, from environmental activists like Greenpeace to UN resolutions, and even led to internal scandals in France.
With thousands of veterans and Polynesian civilians filing complaints about cancer and birth defects due to radiation.
In 1995, the final test Zuthos triggered global protests, contributing to President Jacques Chirac's decision to sign the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1996, ending the testing program. Nevertheless, the legacy of the force to frap remains an inseparable part of modern French identity. Today, under President Emmanuel Macron, France continues to maintain a nuclear arsenal of about 300 warheads. With new Su-Frankless nuclear submarines and upgraded M51 missiles, asserting its leadership role in the European Union and NATO, Gaullism remains vibrant, a reminder that defiance is not just military strength, but also a spirit of self-reliance, helping France overcome crises from the Cold War to contemporary challenges like populism and climate change. The Gerbois Blue explosion was not just a historical moment. It is the eternal echo of a nation that refused and imposed destiny, singing its anthem of freedom in the desert and the ocean. China, the flame of the waking dragon. If the stories of Britain and France are about a faded, glorious past and a present full of internal contradictions, then China's story is deeply marked by the future. A future they not only dream, but are determined to shape with an iron fist and sharp intellect. This is not a nostalgic obsession with lost glory, as in Britain with its setting sun empire, nor a philosophical pride as in France with its ideological revolutions. No, China's ambition is raw, pragmatic, and uncompromising, forged from a century of humiliation. From the Opium Wars, when Western powers used cannons and warships to force open an ancient empire, to the shameful division by unequal treaties, and culminating in the brutal invasion by Japan during the Second Sino-Japanese War, which left millions of Chinese dead in agony. These are deep scars on the national soul, nurturing an iron will to survive under the communist regime, where survival is not just a national issue, but a historical mission. Under Mao Zedong, the founding father of modern revolutionary China, the country endured a long and bloody civil war, ending with the establishment of the People's Republic of China on October 1st, 1949, a moment when Mao declared, "From the Tiananmen Gate that the Chinese people have stood up." But the joy of victory was quickly tested by the Korean War, where the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, under Mao's orders, crossed the Yalu River to support Pyongyang against the US-led United Nations forces. Here, they directly faced nuclear threats from Washington, including public statements by General Douglas MacArthur, the commander of US forces, about using atomic bombs to end the war quickly by dropping them on bridges and cities in Korea, and even on Chinese territory if necessary. Those threats were no joke. They echoed the memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki just 5 years earlier, a reminder that nuclear power was not just a weapon but a tool of global domination. For Mao, the atomic bomb was not a luxury or a strategic toy. It was a prerequisite for survival in a hostile world. Where superpowers like the US and the Soviet Union saw China as potential prey, he was famous for his immortal saying, "The atomic bomb is a paper tiger, uttered in a context to belittle its power, reassure the people, and showcase the indomitable revolutionary spirit of the Communist Party of China." And outwardly, it was propaganda to boost national morale, turning fear into collective strength. But deep down, Mao, a pragmatic and ruthless strategist, understood better than anyone that in the global political jungle full of predators, to avoid being eaten, you must become a real tiger yourself, with sharp nuclear fangs and a roar powerful enough to shake the entire planet. He realized that without weapons of mass destruction, China would forever be a victim in the great games of Washington and Moscow, where secret deals could divide Asia without consulting Beijing. China's nuclear ambition became even more urgent after the split with its former communist brother, Soviet Union, in the late 1950s. An event known as the Sino-Soviet split, rooted in ideological disagreements and power struggles. Moscow, under Khrushchev, withdrew all technical support and nuclear experts in 1959, leaving Beijing isolated between two rival superpowers. This was not just a loss of technology, but a geopolitical shock. China suddenly found itself squeezed between two giants, with the US to the west and the Soviet Union to the north. In this context, Mao turned loneliness into motivation, pushing for a self-reliant nuclear program against all odds. With an extraordinary and sacrificial effort, while the country was still mired in poverty and chaos after disastrous economic policies like the Great Leap, forward, a man-made tragedy that led to a great famine causing an estimated 15 to 55 million deaths, according to Western scholars. China poured all its resources into its nuclear program. The project was officially launched in 1955, with initial help from the Soviet Union in the form of blueprints and experts. But after Moscow's withdrawal, Beijing had to rely entirely on itself. The project, symbolically named to bombs, one satellite referring to the atomic bomb, the hydrogen bomb, and an artificial satellite, mobilized thousands of scientists, engineers, and workers, including talents returning from abroad like Qian Zusin, the father of China's missile program, who was deported by the US on suspicion of espionage, and later made decisive contributions to propulsion technology. These people worked under harsh conditions: lack of modern equipment, scarce resources, and immense political pressure from Mao, who considered failure unacceptable. Scientists had to produce enriched uranium from raw or build reactors by hand, and even use horses to transport materials through treacherous terrain. On October 16, 1964, at the Lopnor test site in the Xinjiang desert, a remote, secret, and harsh area where sandstorms and biting cold could kill a person faster than radiation, a giant fireball lit up the horizon. Test 596 was a resounding success, with a yield equivalent to 22 kilotons of TNT achieved in just 32 months from the start of the actual fabrication phase. It was not just a technical explosion. It was the culmination of national resilience, a living testament that China could overcome any adversity to assert its position. That explosion was not just the sound of a first nuclear bomb, it was the resounding roar of a dragon that had lain dormant for centuries under the dust of time and foreign humiliation, now awakened with destructive power and an indomitable will. It signaled the official end of the century of humiliation, a term the Chinese used to refer to the period from the Opium Wars to 1949 and the beginning of a new, ambitious journey to return China to the center of the world, as in the prosperous times of the Han or Tang dynasties. The Lopnur event quickly led to staggering progress. Just 3 years later, on June 17, 1967, China successfully tested its first hydrogen bomb with a yield of 3.3 megatons, demonstrating advanced thermonuclear capability. And by 1970, they launched the Dongfang-Hung-1 satellite, completing the one-satellite goal, while also developing intercontinental ballistic missiles like the Dongfeng-5, capable of reaching the U.S. mainland. These achievements not only solidified China's position as an independent nuclear power, dependent on no one, a stark contrast to allies like India or Pakistan, but also changed the global balance of power. The awakening of the Chinese nuclear dragon forced the superpowers to see Beijing in a different light. The U.S., under President Richard Nixon and his advisor Henry Kissinger, realized that China could not be isolated forever. Nixon's historic visit to Beijing in February 1972, prepared through secret channels, paved the way for the normalization of relations in 1979, creating a U.S.-China-Soviet strategic triangle to contain the Soviet Union. From then on, China was no longer a victim, but a major player on the geopolitical chessboard, with a nuclear arsenal now estimated at over 500 warheads and a continuous modernization program under Xi Jinping, including Type 09 for nuclear submarines and DF-17 hypersonic missiles. The journey from Lopner to the present is proof that, for China, nuclear weapons are not just a shield for survival, but also the flame that shapes the future. A future where the dragon not only awakens, but also soars to dominate the world's skies. 3 nations, 3 stories. Britain's nostalgia for a lost empire, France's defiant pride against dependency, and China's iron will to survive and rise. They all sought the same answer: the atomic bomb. The nuclear club was no longer a 2-player game between the US and the Soviet Union. It had become a complex chessboard where new players, their own motives and fears, were reshaping the global balance of power, leading to the proliferation of nuclear weapons and later control treaties, like the 1968 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Each nation had a reason, a story, a unique obsession to pursue this ultimate power. But behind them lie bigger questions. Is power an addiction? Once you have tasted the feeling of being respected and feared, can you stop? Where is the line between a legitimate ambition for self-defense and an arrogance that can lead to destruction? And in today's world, with new emerging powers like India, Pakistan, or North Korea, will history repeat itself? Leave your thoughts below. Like shows you realize the nuclear chess game is more complex than we think, with consequences that extend to this day. India and Pakistan. The South Asian nuclear bomb. In the previous chapters, we journeyed through the race of giants, the US, the Soviet Union, and the European powers, China. Their game, though tense, was played on a global stage, with vast oceans separating them. The logic of mutual destruction, though insane, had an abstract distance to it. But tonight, we turn to a place where nuclear weapons are not a distant geopolitical tool. They are a dagger held to a neighbor's throat. Welcome to South Asia, where 2 nations, 2 ancient civilizations, are bound by a common history and divided by a wound that never heals. This is the story of India and Pakistan twin brothers, born from a bloody partition, and now both hold the fire of the gods in their hands. To understand the nuclear race in South Asia, we must go back to 1947, when the British Empire granted independence. Instead of one unified nation, 2 countries were born from the event known as the partition: India, with a Hindu majority, and Pakistan, with a Muslim majority. This was not a peaceful separation. It was a continental tear, causing one of the largest migrations and episodes of violence in history. Millions died. Tens of millions lost their homes. Hatred and mistrust were sown into the very foundations of both nations from their birth. In the following decades, India, as the larger nation, saw itself as the natural leader of the region. They were the world's largest democracy, a champion of the non-aligned movement. But they felt surrounded. To the north, China, the enemy that had defeated them in the 1962 border war, detonated its first atomic bomb in 1964. India could not sit idly by. On May 18, 1974, in the Rajasthan desert, India conducted its first nuclear test. But they didn't call it a weapons test. With poetic irony, they codenamed it Smiling Buddha. The world was informed that this was a peaceful nuclear explosion, but no one was fooled. The Buddha's smile was not one of enlightenment. It was a cold smile, a warning sent to Beijing, and more importantly, to its brotherly neighbor to the west. India had declared itself the new master of the nuclear flame, the holder of supreme power in South Asia. The reaction from Pakistan was not just anxiety, it was a national panic. For them, a nuclear-armed India was an existential threat. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, Pakistan's prime minister at the time, made an immortal statement, a vow that would shape his country's destiny for decades to come. If India builds the bomb, We will eat grass or leaves, even go hungry, but we will get one of our own. We have no other choice. That vow was not empty rhetoric, it became a national obsession. Pakistan began a secret nuclear program, a desperate effort to catch up with its rival. And they found their savior in a controversial figure, Dr. Abdul Qadir Khan. A Q Khan, a metallurgist working in Europe, became a national hero in Pakistan, but was considered by the West to be the world's most dangerous nuclear proliferator. Using a network of spies and front companies, Khan stole and smuggled centrifuge blueprints and necessary technology from Europe, bringing them back to his homeland. It was the theft of the century, driven by patriotism and an iron will. While the country struggled with poverty and political instability, Pakistan's best minds worked silently in secret labs with one single goal: to fulfill the eat grass vow. For 24 years, the world lived in a dangerous ambiguity. India had the bomb, but did not officially admit it. Pakistan was believed to be developing a bomb, but no one knew for sure. And then, in May 1998, everything changed. India's new nationalist government decided to end the ambiguity. They conducted a series of 5 underground nuclear tests, codenamed Operation Shakti. This time there was no smiling Buddha. It was a clear declaration of power. The Indian Prime Minister proudly declared his country a nuclear power. The pressure now fell on Pakistan. The international community called for restraint. But domestically, the voices of the people and the military roared for an answer. Not responding would mean humiliation, an admission of inferiority. Just 2 weeks later, Pakistan gave its answer. In the remote Chagai Hills in Baluchistan, they detonated 6 nuclear devices over 2 days.
Ow!
It was said that the mountains turned white from the heat. Pakistan had evened the score. The sibling rivalry had reached its most terrifying climax. South Asia officially became the only place on Earth with 2 hostile nuclear-armed powers engaged in an active conflict, sharing a long and volatile border. What makes this confrontation even more dangerous than the Cold War is one name: Kashmir. The beautiful land of Kashmir, hailed as paradise on Earth, is the unhealed wound of the partition. Both India and Pakistan claim sovereignty over it, and they have fought several wars for it. It is a border in a constant state of tension, with skirmishes, terrorist attacks, and a heavy military presence. Unlike the US and the Soviet Union, separated by oceans, a missile from India would take only minutes to reach Pakistan, and vice versa. There is no time to think, to verify a false alarm. A small conventional conflict in Kashmir, like the Kargil War in 1999, which happened right after both countries got the bomb, could quickly escalate out of control. One wrong decision, one misunderstanding, could trigger a regional nuclear war, killing tens of millions and causing a global nuclear winter. In their quest for security, both India and Pakistan have created a state of permanent and terrifying insecurity for themselves. They are trapped in a cage of their own making, a balance of terror, where the smile of the Buddha confronts the vow to eat grass. The question for you is, what is more frightening? A powerful enemy far away, or a brother you both love and hate whom you can never escape, right next door? The fear of annihilation, or the fear of being inferior in the eyes of a lifelong rival. In such an endless confrontation, can there ever be such a thing as victory? Leave your thoughts below, and a like shows you understand that sometimes the most dangerous conflicts stem from the most familiar wounds. Israel, the Pandora's box that was never opened. We have journeyed through loud arms races and public declarations of war. From the roar of the 2 superpowers in the Cold War to the proud roar of European powers and the resentful roar of the 2 South Asian brothers. All of them, for different reasons, had one thing in common. They wanted the world to know they possessed the fire of the god of death. They flaunted their power, believing that transparency, however frightening, was the best form of deterrence. But tonight, we will talk about a different kind of power. A power that lies not in earth-shattering explosions, but in a persistent whisper. power built on silence. Welcome to the Middle East, and to the world's most open secret, Israel's nuclear program. In the nuclear club, Israel is a unique member. They don't play by anyone else's rules. They employ a diplomatic policy known by a poetic term, amimet, or strategic ambiguity. This policy can be summarized in one sentence. We will not be the first country to introduce nuclear weapons into the Middle East. But we will not be the second either. What does it mean? It means Israel never confirms, but also never denies that it possesses nuclear weapons. They let the world, especially their enemies. They have created a ghost, a Schrödinger's monster that looms over the region. It both exists and does not exist. Depending on how you look at the box, experts estimate they have between 80 and 400 nuclear warheads, but the real number remains one of the most closely guarded secrets on the planet. The story of this ghost begins in the 1950s, in the harsh Negev desert. With secret help from France, Israel began building a massive facility near the town of Dimona. To the outside world, it was cleverly disguised. When asked, Israeli officials would say it was a textile factory or an agricultural research station. But underground, a nuclear reactor and a plutonium reprocessing plant were being built to essential components for making bombs. This secret was kept for decades, until 1986, when a technician named Mordecai Vanunu, who had worked at Dimona, decided to reveal the truth to the world. He smuggled out photographs and detailed information to a British newspaper. But before the story could be published, Vanunu was lured to Rome by Mossad agents, kidnapped, and secretly brought back to Israel. He was convicted of treason and espionage and spent 18 years in prison, much of it in solitary confinement. This drastic reaction was more than a confirmation. It showed that Israel was willing to do anything to protect its ambiguity. But why? Why hide a weapon that other nations proudly display? To understand this, we must understand Israel's psychology. Their nuclear program was not born from imperial ambition like Britain's, or philosophical pride like France's. It was born from trauma, from the ashes of the Holocaust. For the founding generation of Israel, the memory of 6 million Jews being led to the gas chambers without the ultimate means of self-defense was a scar that would never heal. The atomic bomb for them was not a tool of aggression. It was an insurance policy. It was the tangible and absolute guarantee for the vow never again. And from that, an unofficial, chilling, and more resolute doctrine than Maud was born, the Samson option. According to the Bible, Samson was a Jewish hero who, after being captured and blinded by his Philistine enemies, used his last ounce of strength to pull down the pillars of a temple, killing himself and thousands of his enemies along with him. The Samson option in a nuclear context means, if the state of Israel faces the threat of complete annihilation by a conventional attack from hostile Arab nations, it will not go quietly. It will bring down the temple of the Middle East. It will unleash its nuclear arsenal, ensuring that the victors will not survive to celebrate. This is not deterrence to keep the peace. This is deterrence through the promise of a shared apocalypse. Perhaps the most astonishing part of this story is not the existence of the bomb, but the complicit silence of the world, especially the United States. Why would a country that has always led the charge against nuclear proliferation, imposing harsh sanctions on Iran or North Korea, turn a blind eye to Israel's program? The answer lies in a secret meeting in 1969 between President Richard Nixon and Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir. An informal agreement was reached, a don't ask, don't tell policy. The U.S. would not pressure Israel to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and would no longer inspect Dimona. As long as Israel did not conduct public tests and did not declare itself a nuclear power, it was hypocrisy of the highest order, born from geopolitical calculation. Israel is America's most important strategic ally in the Middle East. Acknowledging their nuclear program would force the U.S. to impose sanctions, under its own laws, fracturing the alliance. So, the whole world chose not to look at the elephant in the room. They knew it was there, they felt its weight, but they pretended not to see it. This ambiguity has become a double-edged sword. On one hand, it may have prevented some large-scale wars, as Arab nations always had to be wary of Israel's nuclear ghost. On the other hand, it has fueled a shadow arms race. The existence of Israel's bomb is the biggest reason driving countries like Iran to pursue their own nuclear programs, creating a never-ending spiral of tension and mistrust. The ghost of Dimona continues to haunt the Middle East. It is the invisible factor in every peace negotiation, every conflict, and every political decision in the region. The question for you is a silent threat more powerful than an open declaration of war? How much weight does a secret that everyone knows but no one speaks of carry? And in the game of survival, are there any rules, or is it all just the will to survive at any cost? Leave your thoughts below. A like shows you understand that sometimes the things left unsaid have the greatest power. North Korea, the bomb of survival. We have journeyed through the stories of superpowers, aging empires, eternal rivals, and silent ghosts. They pursued nuclear weapons for glory, for pride, for strategic balance, or for a vow etched from the ashes of the past. But tonight, we will talk about a nation that belongs to none of those categories. A nation not seeking glory or global domination. They seek only one thing, the most primitive thing: survival. This is the story of North Korea, the shunned child of the nuclear family. The final outlier, a hermit kingdom that has turned itself into a fortress. And in their hands, the atomic bomb is not the crown of a king, the sword of an outcast, ready to drag the whole world into the abyss with them. To understand North Korea's nuclear obsession, we must go back not to 2006 when they tested their first bomb, but to the 1950s during the Korean War. That war, for America, is a forgotten conflict. But for North Korea, it was a founding trauma, a horrific memory seared into the national psyche. For 3 years, the U.S. Air Force dropped more bombs on North Korea than the total number of bombs dropped in the Pacific Theater during World War II. Cities were flattened. A U.S. general once said that every town in North Korea was nothing but a collection of chimneys. From those ashes, leader Kim Il-sung drew a lesson he would never forget. Never be weak in front of America again. And from that, an ideology, almost a religion, was born to rule the country. Jukki, or self-reliance. Jukki teaches that North Korea can trust no one, depend on no one. They must stand on their own feet, build their own destiny, in a hostile world that always seeks to destroy them. For decades, they relied on the Soviet Union's nuclear umbrella. But then, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. For North Korea, it was not just a geopolitical event, it was a fundamental betrayal. Their big brother, their protector, their shield, had vanished overnight. They were completely alone, facing the US military stationed in South Korea directly. At the same time, another disaster struck. Their planned economy collapsed, causing a terrible famine in the 1990s known as the Arduous March. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, starved to death. And here lies the central paradox of the North Korean story. While its people were eating tree bark to survive, the regime poured every last resource, every meager coin, into a single goal: building nuclear weapons. To the outside world, this was an act of madness and inhumanity. But in the logic of the Pyongyang regime, it was perfectly rational. A well-fed nation without the ability to defend itself would be easy prey for great powers, like Iraq or Libya. But a starving nation that possesses nuclear weapons is a nation no one dares to touch. The bomb was not meant to bring prosperity to the people. It was meant to ensure the survival of the regime. In 2003, they officially withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, an act of open defiance. And on October 9, 2006, deep underground in a remote mountainous region, they detonated their first bomb. The explosion was relatively small, possibly a partial failure, but politically it was a deafening roar. The outcast child had kicked down the door of the nuclear club on its own. Since then, North Korea has perfected a repetitive script, a dangerous dance on the brink of war. The cycle goes like this. They commit a provocation, a nuclear test, or a long-range missile launch. The world reacts with anger. The UN Security Council passes increasingly harsh sanctions. North Korea responds with belligerent rhetoric, threatening to turn Seoul or Tokyo into a sea of fire. Tensions reach a peak, and then they offer to negotiate. In negotiations, they use their nuclear program as their only bargaining chip to trade for food aid, fuel, and sanctions relief. The talks eventually collapse, and the cycle begins anew, with an even bigger test than before. Under Kim Jong-un, who succeeded his father and grandfather, North Korea's nuclear program has accelerated at an alarming rate. Since taking power in 2011, he has overseen 6 underground nuclear tests, a number that surpasses the total tests under his father Kim Jong-il and grandfather Kim Il-sung. These tests include claims of thermonuclear bombs in 2016 and 2017, marking a significant leap in nuclear technology. More importantly, North Korea has successfully developed intercontinental ballistic missiles like the Hwasong-14 and Hwasong-15, first tested in 2017, with an estimated range of up to 10,000 to 13,000 kilometers, capable of reaching the U.S. mainland. These advancements are not just symbolic, but are a testament to the massive investment in the weapons program, despite strict UN sanctions. This was the final red line the world had hoped North Korea would not cross. Pyongyang is no longer a regional nuisance. They have become a direct threat to the national security of the world's only superpower, the United States. With the ability to nuclearize ICBMs, North Korea can threaten major cities like New York or Los Angeles, forcing Washington to view Pyongyang as a true nuclear adversary. And by doing so, Kim Jong-un has achieved what his father and grandfather always craved, forcing the President of the United States to sit at the negotiating table with him as an equal. The historic summits between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump in Singapore and Hanoi are clear evidence of this. Although they ultimately failed due to disagreements on denuclearization and sanctions relief, for the Pyongyang regime, the lessons of history are clear and harsh. Saddam Hussein of Iraq did not have real weapons of mass destruction, and he was overthrown by a US-led coalition in 2003, leading to his tragic death. Muammar Gaddafi of Libya even voluntarily gave up his nuclear program in 2003 in exchange for better relations with the West. But just 8 years later, he was overthrown and killed in a NATO-backed civil war. These examples have reinforced North Korea's belief that nuclear weapons are not a tool for offense, but the ultimate talisman to protect the regime from outside interference. From Pyongyang's perspective, possessing the atomic bomb is essential for survival. It creates a balance of deterrence, preventing any intention of invasion from the US or its allies, while also enhancing its negotiating position on the international stage. Without nuclear weapons, North Korea could suffer the same fate as Iraq or Libya. Isolated, attacked, collapsed. This logic is further reinforced by the history of the Korean War, when the US threatened to use nuclear weapons, leading Pyongyang to view nuclear capability as insurance against a repeat of the tragedy. The international changes brought about by North Korea's nuclear program are profound and multifaceted. First, it has upended the security balance in East Asia, forcing South Korea and Japan to strengthen their missile defense systems and reconsider their own nuclear policies, even sparking debate about developing their own nuclear weapons. On a global scale, the development of ICBMs has spurred nuclear negotiations, but has also increased tensions, leading to stricter economic sanctions from the United Nations, affecting North Korea's economy and exacerbating famine. However, it also demonstrates that nuclear capability can force great powers to dialogue rather than confront. For example, the talks under Trump temporarily reduced testing, though they did not achieve complete denuclearization. Furthermore, the existence of this program challenges the principle of non-proliferation, encouraging other countries like Iran to learn the self-defense deterrence model, leading to the risk of global nuclear proliferation. The outside world faces a paradox. Sanctions may push North Korea into a corner, making them cling even more tightly to their nuclear weapons, while negotiations require accepting the partial reality that Pyongyang is already a de facto nuclear state. Is the logic of someone cornered frightening? When a nation believes that nuclear weapons are its only ticket to survival, is there any sanction strong enough to stop them? And what should we as the outside world do when faced with the fact that sometimes the only way to prevent a war is to accept the existence of a bomb in the hands of someone we don't trust? Leave your thoughts below. The like shows you have faced with us the most difficult paradox of the nuclear world. Countries that have given up the atomic bomb. Throughout our journey, we have discovered an almost universal truth. Once a nation tastes nuclear power, it never gives it up. The bomb is an addiction, a ticket to the club of the gods, the ultimate security guarantee. Its pursuit seems to be a one-way street. But tonight, we will talk about a different path, a much rarer and more arduous one. We will talk about the nations that stood on the pinnacle of power, that held the thunderbolt of Zeus in their hands, and then they chose to put it down. This is the story of the countries that gave up nuclear weapons. An act of extraordinary courage or of deadly naivety? History has provided very different answers. The first story takes us to the southern tip of Africa, to a nation once isolated and shunned by the rest of the world. South Africa, under the racist apartheid regime, ruled by a white minority, the apartheid regime lived in a state of constant fear. Surrounded by hostile neighboring countries and sanctioned by the international community, they saw threats everywhere. And from that paranoia, a secret nuclear program was born. In the 1980s, South Africa successfully built 6 atomic bombs. These were not weapons to project great power status. These were the weapons of a cornered regime, a final insurance policy. But then, a miraculous change occurred. The apartheid regime crumbled from within. Nelson Mandela was freed. A new multiracial democracy was about to be born. And in that historic moment, the outgoing white government, under the leadership of President F.W. de Klerk, made an unprecedented decision. They voluntarily dismantled their entire nuclear arsenal. This was not just a strategic decision to prevent the weapons from falling into the hands of the new government. It was a profoundly symbolic act. The bomb was a product of a dark era of fear and oppression. By destroying it, the new South Africa was performing a baptism. They were burying the sins of the past, washing their hands so they could rejoin the international community with a clean slate. In 1991, South Africa destroyed its last bomb and joined the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Their action proved one thing: there is another way. A nation can choose peace over power, integration over isolation. It is a story full of hope. The second story is much more complex and tragic. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it didn't just leave a power vacuum, it left an unwanted and extremely dangerous legacy. Thousands of Soviet nuclear warheads were scattered not only in Russia, but also in 3 newly independent republics: Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine. Overnight, Ukraine suddenly became the world's 3rd largest nuclear power, with an arsenal larger than that of Britain, France, and China combined. Kazakhstan was also among the top. They were orphans, unwillingly inheriting the keys to doomsday. The world was terrified. The prospect of loose nukes falling into the wrong hands made Washington and Moscow, for the first time, completely agree. Immense diplomatic pressure was put on these 3 nations. The offer was clear: give up your nuclear weapons, transfer them to Russia for destruction, and in return, your security and sovereignty will be guaranteed. And that guarantee was formalized in 1994 in a document called the Budapest Memorandum. Here, Russia, the US, and the UK jointly signed a sacred vow to respect the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. Facing economic and political pressure and trusting the promises of the great powers, all 3 nations agreed. Convoys of nuclear warheads silently left their territories, heading for Russia. By 1996, the last warhead had left Ukraine. They had chosen the path of trust. They had bet their future on a piece of paper, on the promise of the international community. For many years, that decision seemed to be the right one. It was hailed as a triumph of diplomacy, a model for disarmament. But a promise like the paper it's written on can be torn up. In 2014, and again in 2022, one of the very nations that had signed the vow to protect Ukraine resheeted it up. They annexed Crimea and launched a full-scale invasion, blatantly violating the sovereignty and territorial integrity they had pledged to protect. The Budapest Memorandum became a cruel and painful lesson. Ukraine had given up its ultimate deterrent in exchange for an empty promise. Their choice of peace and trust was met with war and betrayal. The story of Ukraine has become a ghost that haunts non-proliferation negotiations today. It is a reminder that in the brutal world of politics, a promise, no matter how sacred, cannot compare to the power of a nuclear warhead. So, is giving up nuclear weapons brave or foolish? The story of South Africa gives us hope that a nation can choose a brighter future. But the story of Ukraine shows us a harsh reality, that in an imperfect world, trust can be a deadly gamble. The final question of this chapter is perhaps the most unsettling. In an imperfect world, is trusting the promises of others a dangerous naivety? Can a nation ever be truly safe without holding the ultimate power in its hands? Or has the history of Ukraine taught us a cruel lesson that in the end, the only reliable power is the power you can hold yourself? Leave your thoughts below. Like shows you have faced with us one of the most painful paradoxes of modern history. Treaties and nuclear politics, the fragile chains. Throughout our journey, we have witnessed an alarming truth. The nuclear fire once lit tends to spread. From the confrontation of two superpowers, it has spread to old empires, sworn enemies, and even outcast nations. The world has become a room full of gasoline, with more and more people holding matches. Faced with that terrifying prospect, humanity did what it has always done when facing chaos. It tried to write rules. They sat down around elegant negotiating tables in Geneva, Vienna, and Moscow, trying to use the language of law and diplomacy to tame a weapon of inhuman power. This is the story of humanity's noble, contradictory, and sometimes desperate efforts to control its own most dangerous creation. This is the story of nuclear treaties. In the 1960s, the greatest fear was the domino effect. Nuclear Club already had 5 members, and experts feared that soon dozens of other countries would follow suit. To prevent this apocalyptic scenario, a foundational treaty was born in 1968, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The NPT is not just a document, it is a grand bargain, a 3-way promise built on a fragile balance. The first promise: the non-nuclear weapon states pledge never to seek or acquire them. This is a huge sacrifice, a voluntary renunciation of the ultimate power. The second promise: in return, the 5 nuclear weapon states commit to negotiate in good faith towards reducing and ultimately eliminating their own arsenals. This is the moral foundation of the entire treaty, a promise that their monopoly is only temporary. The third promise: all nations, without discrimination, have the right to access nuclear technology for peaceful purposes, such as energy production or medicine. This is the olive branch, the incentive for those who play by the rules. For over 50 years, the NPT has been surprisingly successful. As countries in the world have signed it, and the prospect of a world with dozens of nuclear powers has not materialized. But it is not perfect. 3 countries, India, Pakistan, and Israel, ever signed and went on to develop their own bombs. In one country, North Korea, signed, cheated in secret, and then brazenly withdrew from the treaty. The NPT is like a beautiful set of laws with no police force. It relies on honor, in a world where honor is often trumped by self-interest. If the NPT was the rulebook for the world, then a series of other treaties were the private, tense dialogue between the 2 greatest enemies, the US and the Soviet Union. Realizing that their race was pushing them both to the brink of bankruptcy and annihilation, they began a complex diplomatic dance. First came SALT in the 1970s. SALT did not reduce weapons. It merely froze the number of ballistic missiles and submarines each side could deploy. Imagine two athletes in a frantic race suddenly agreeing not to run any faster. It was a small step, but a revolutionary one, marking the first time the two sworn enemies admitted they were in the same sinking boat. Then came a real breakthrough. The INF Treaty in 1987. This treaty didn't just limit, but completely eliminated an entire class of weapons: intermediate-range missiles based in Europe. For the first time, both sides agreed not only to stop building more, but to destroy weapons they already had. The image of President Reagan and leader Gorbachev signing the treaty became a symbol of hope that the Cold War could truly end. And finally, as the Soviet Union collapsed, that hope peaked with the START treaties. This was no longer about limitation, but actual reduction. Thousands of strategic nuclear warheads were taken off high alert. The two giants were finally starting to put down their guns. A network of on-site inspections, transparent communication channels, and a fragile trust was built. The arms control architecture, painstakingly built over decades, seemed to be one of humanity's greatest achievements. But structures built on trust are as fragile as trust itself. Today, as we look back in 2025, that great structure is shaking to its foundations. The NF Treaty is dead. In 2019, it officially collapsed amid mutual blame between the US and Russia. One of the most important pillars was removed. The new START treaties are on life support, their future uncertain. The trust, the glue that held the entire system together, has evaporated. It has been replaced by a new era of competition and mistrust, not just between the US and Russia, but also with the rise of China, nuclear power not bound by any bilateral treaties. The old fears are returning. The chains that once bound the monster are rusting and breaking. The story of nuclear treaties is a story about human nature. It shows our extraordinary ability to cooperate and build complex systems to save ourselves. But it also shows the fragility of those systems when faced with mistrust, ambition, and the inherent instinct for power. Our final question is humanity capable of self-restraint? Can we build a peace based on trust? Or will we always revert to the primitive logic of fear and dominance? Can a treaty, no matter how beautifully worded, truly bind the inherent instincts of mankind? Leave your thoughts below. A like shows you recognize that peace is a structure that must be built and protected every day. The future and dangers. Living under the mushroom cloud, we have journeyed together on a long and dark path. We have witnessed the birth of a god of death in the desert, walked the corridors of power during the Cold War, seen the flames spread to the hidden corners of the world, and heard both the promises and betrayals in the effort to control it. The story of the atomic bomb, until now, has been a story of nations, a drama of superpowers, empires, rivals. But as we enter the 21st century, the stage is changing. The old actors are still there, but new roles with more unpredictable scripts are beginning to appear. The shadow of the mushroom cloud has not receded. It is only stretching longer, covering us with new fears. For many years, the world's greatest fear of nuclear proliferation has focused on one country, Iran. Iran's story is a final test for the entire arms control architecture we have discussed. Iran's motives are a complex mix of Persian national pride, fierce regional competition with Israel and Saudi Arabia, and a deep mistrust of the West, stemming from the 1953 US-backed coup. They look at the example of North Korea and believe that. In a cruel world, nuclear weapons are the ultimate guarantee for the survival of the regime. For a brief moment of hope, the world seemed to have found a solution. The 2015 Iran nuclear deal was a triumph of diplomacy, where sanctions were lifted in exchange for monitoring and restrictions on Tehran's nuclear program. But like many treaties before it, it was fragile. When the US withdrew from the deal, that hope was shattered. Today, in 2025, Iran stands on the threshold of the nuclear club. They have enriched uranium to near weapons-grade levels. The world is once again holding its breath. An Iranian bomb would not be just a bomb. It would be a spark, capable of igniting a frantic arms race across the Middle East, with Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt all likely to follow suit. The domino fear from the 1960s is returning, but on a chessboard that is far more unstable and flammable. But while we are still focused on the familiar nightmare of new countries joining the club, the nature of the threat itself is transforming. This is the ultimate failure scenario of deterrence theory. The logic of MAD only works when both sides have something to lose. Cities, people, a future. But what about a terrorist organization? They have no territory to be counterattacked, no population to protect. For a fanatical group that welcomes the apocalypse, a nuclear explosion in New York or London is not a failure. It is a victory. The prospect of a dirty bomb or a stolen nuclear device being detonated by an invisible, undeterrable enemy remains the deepest fear of every security agency in the world. For decades, there has been an unspoken taboo since 1945. Nuclear weapons are unusable. They are too big, too destructive. But today, the great powers are developing lower-yield tactical nuclear weapons. In theory, they are made to be used on the battlefield without causing an apocalypse. But that is precisely what makes them more dangerous. It blurs the red line between conventional and nuclear war. A general, in a tough battle, might be tempted to use a small nuclear bomb to gain an advantage, believing it will not escalate. That is a slippery slope that could lead straight to hell. The taboo is eroding, and this is the most terrifying scenario, something straight out of science fiction. What happens when two of humanity's most powerful and uncontrollable creations in nuclear weapons and artificial intelligence merge? To shorten reaction times to mere seconds, countries might grant launch authority to AI systems. An AI operating on cold logic might calculate that a preemptive strike is the most rational solution in a crisis. It would not have human hesitation, no ability to read subtle diplomatic cues, no understanding of the value of de-escalation. That would be the ultimate loss of control. The monster we created now has a brain of its own, a brain we cannot comprehend. So what are we left with after all this? The answer is sad but unavoidable. The bomb is here to stay, and the knowledge of how to build it cannot be unlearned. We and our children forever after will be the species that learned how to split the atom and destroy ourselves. After all the complex analysis of politics, strategy, and technology, the ultimate problem is not in uranium or plutonium. The problem lies in the human heart itself, in its eternal conflict. Tribalism, fear, pride, mistrust, these are the truly dangerous radioactive materials. The bomb is just a mirror reflecting both the best and the worst in us. There are no easy answers. There's no final treaty that can completely eliminate the threat. There is only a daily, difficult, and never-ending effort to manage our own worst impulses. Nuclear peace is not a destination. It is a fragile equilibrium, a tightrope walk over an abyss with no safety net. The shadow of the mushroom cloud has become a permanent part of the human condition. The final question of this entire journey, the one we must carry with us after the video ends, is: can we mature in time with our own technology? Can our wisdom triumph over our most primitive instincts? Or are we forever children playing with the fire of the gods? Leave your final thoughts below. A final like shows you have walked with us to the very end of one of the most important stories of our time. Our journey began with a whisper, a warning of a weapon that could rival the gods. We stood together in the desert and witnessed the birth of an artificial sun. Walked through the top-secret corridors of the Cold War, where two giants played a game of chess with the survival of the entire planet. We saw the fire spread into the hands of dying empires, proud nations, rival brothers, silent ghosts, and even the outcasts. We witnessed the noble and desperate attempts to shackle the monster with ink and paper, and then saw those chains rust and break. And now, after passing through all the glory, the tragedies, and the paradoxes, what are we left with? We stand here in the 21st century, under a sky still haunted by the shadow of the mushroom cloud. The final question, the most important question, is no longer who has the bomb, or how does it work. The final question is, what does it mean? The greatest and most terrifying paradox of the nuclear age is this. The very weapon created to destroy cities is the same thing that has prevented world wars for the past 80 years. Since the ashes of Nagasaki, there has not been a single direct war between nuclear powers. Human history, which had been a long, endless series of wars between empires, suddenly has a pause. The long peace. But what kind of peace is it? It is not the tranquility of a garden. It is the stillness of a potential graveyard. It is not a peace built on trust or understanding, but a peace built on absolute terror. It is the peace of two scorpions in a bottle, each knowing that one sting will lead to death for both. We have not learned to love each other more. We have only learned to fear each other more effectively. We have avoided a hot war, only to live forever in a cold war of the mind, a state of constant tension. A simmering anxiety that one day a miscalculation, a false alarm, a deranged leader could end it all. We were not consumed by the fire, but we have accepted to live forever in its shadow. And that leads to the second core question. Do we hold the bomb, or does the bomb hold us? We pride ourselves on our free will, but since 1945, the bomb has invisibly shaped our history. It has redrawn the map of military alliances. It has decided which nations are superpowers and which must bow. It has influenced elections, sparked revolutions, and whispered in the ear of every leader in every crisis. It demands absolute rationality from a species that is inherently emotional and unstable. It forces us to spend trillions of dollars to build weapons whose only purpose is to never be used. We are not its masters. We have become its guardians, the priests of a cult of destruction, bound by the rules and logic of the very monster we created. We spend our lives watching over it, while it shapes our every decision. So in the end, the problem is not the bomb. The problem was never the bomb. Uranium is not evil. Plutonium holds no grudges. The bomb is just an amplifier, a mirror reflecting the nature of its creator. It reflects our extraordinary intellect, our ability to uncover the deepest secrets of the universe. But it also reflects our immaturity, the tribalism, fear, pride, and mistrust that have haunted us since the dawn of time. The nuclear paradox is the paradox of the human condition. We have the brains of gods, but the hearts of beasts. We have created a power that demands absolute wisdom, while we are still struggling with our most primitive instincts. This journey does not have an easy, optimistic conclusion. There is no magic solution. The knowledge of how to make the bomb is out there, and it will never disappear. Its shadow will forever be a part of the legacy we leave for future generations. The only thing we can do is to keep facing it, keep talking about it, and keep looking into the mirror it holds up. Looking into it, we don't just see the threat from another country. We see ourselves. And maybe, just maybe, realizing that is the first small step on the long, endless road towards true maturity. Thank you for staying awake with me through this long and complex journey. If these stories have touched you, if they have made you think, please leave a final like and subscribe so we can continue to explore the mysteries of the world on the long nights ahead. May you have a deep sleep in a tomorrow where we choose wisdom over power.
You've crossed the story. You felt every pulse in the dark, and I was there with you, quietly, always. That's why I left behind one last thing. Not to explain, not to impress, just to stay with you a little longer. A song I chose with care, as if tucking you in from across time and space. So go on, lay back, the music knows where to take you. you're still here, then you're something rare. Not many stay this long. So, thank you for choosing to stay. I'm here too, still awake, surrounded by the quiet glow of my editing screen, shaping the next stories just for you. If there's anything you want to leave behind, a whisper, a suggestion, even just a symbol, drop it in the comments. Because maybe, tomorrow night, you'll hear yourself echoed in a story that's never been told before. still here, even now? I have a feeling part of you is still wandering somewhere between wakefulness and dreaming. I know that feeling well because I'm still awake with you. In a quiet room, I'm gently laying out layers of sound, each breath, each beat, preparing the next journey we'll take together. If you're still listening, leave me a sign. Let me know how you're feeling or just where you are in this vast world. Because right now, in this stillness, you are not alone. You're still there, aren't you? I can't see you, but I can feel you. Like a soft signal pulsing across the silence. Over here, I'm still working, refining layers of sound, rewriting fragments of voice, building the landscape for our next adventure. One that you might inspire. If an idea comes to you, share it with me. Comment below. A theme, a memory, a strange dream. I read every word because I never tell these stories alone. I tell them with you.